Okay, the Buddha's teaching is all about freedom. Freedom of the mind and freedom of the heart. Because we know quickly that we as human beings are not free. And that's what the Four Noble Truths are all about. They're, first of all, a diagnosis of the human condition, namely that we're not free, that basically we're imprisoned by the heart, by the mind. And secondly, they're an analysis of how we got that way, of what's causing us to be unfree, imprisoned. And finally, the Four Noble Truths are also guidelines on how to attain and achieve freedom. So the Four Noble Truths, what are they? The first is the truth that there is suffering in life. The second is the truth that suffering is caused by craving, by desire. And the third is the truth that if we can decrease suffering or desire, we're going to become, to the extent that we do, we will become freer. And the fourth noble truth is often called the Noble Eightfold Path. And what the Buddha does, and this in the fourth noble truth, that he outlines how we might work toward achieving freedom. So he offers 8 guidelines, 8 things to do. And he calls them, first of all, wise view, and he teaches wise view, wise intention, wise speech, wise action, wise livelihood, wise effort, wise mindfulness, and wise concentration. Those are the big, major categories that he teaches. We're going to explore each of these in these next several weeks because they mean both more and probably other than what they sound like when I just kind of say them off very quickly like this. The Buddha discovered the Four Noble Truths on the night of his enlightenment. They simply became really, really clear to him. He did not make them up. He didn't see that he made them up in any way. In fact, I think it can be said, and others have observed, that those who were spiritual seekers in India at the time of the Buddha's life, they would have agreed entirely, at least with the first 3. The fourth was something new that he added, how to do it, the Noble Eightfold Path, but everybody would have agreed with, like, yeah, sure, this is obvious. So it wasn't like this was stunningly different. In fact, here's what the Buddha said about it. He said about the Fourth Noble Truth, he said, they're a path of great antiquity, an ancient trail, traveled by human beings in far-off distant eras. Nothing new. He saw them as merely a statement of things as they truly are. And here's what Karen Armstrong said about them in her book, Buddha. She said, it's a path that is written into the very structure of existence. Written into the very structure of existence, the Four Noble Truths. And Ayakema, she commented on these, on the Four Noble Truths, and I mentioned Ayakema the last time I spoke. She was a German woman who became a nun in this tradition. She died in the 1980s. And her comment about the Four Noble Truths is, they're an inner reality that left no residue. What does she mean by that? An inner reality that left no residue. What she meant is that completely the problems of suffering were addressed by the Four Noble Truths. Nothing left over. They do it completely if you deeply understood them, embodied them, and followed the Noble Eightfold Path. So the Four Noble Truths really became the framework around which the Buddha spoke. He realized that I said on his night of enlightenment, and that was after 6 intense years, I won't go into that story, of intense years of spiritual searching, and then this and already deeply awakened in many ways, but then on this incredible night of enlightenment, these truths came to him, as did some other insights. And he understood that night. And in the first talk he gave, and he gave it to 5 followers, a month or a little bit over, to some spiritual seekers that he had worked with and really trained with before, he taught the Four Noble Truths the first time out, the first time he taught, and he continued to teach them for the remaining 45 years that he taught. This was the centerpiece, Now, I just recited the Four Noble Truths a minute ago, and they can sound like pretty much like a mouthful if you don't know what they are, if you haven't heard them, if you're new to all this. But I think most of you who have been here and have attended a number of times at IMCC and in many other places, you've probably heard them like lots and lots of times. You know, and maybe some of you have this thought, oh no, Four Noble Truths again. You know, it's like, haven't we heard this before? And the answer is, yeah, you probably you have. You know, our culture is about something that's new and exciting, right? This is what we want, new and exciting. I came across someone, I can't remember who, it might have been Gary Schneider, who talked about traditional cultures, and he said in traditional cultures, the approach was make it do. But in our Western, you know, make do with what you got. But in our culture, it's always make it new, right? We want always what's new and what's exciting, and we certainly see that these days when e-technology is just, we can hardly keep up, you know, new and exciting or whatever it is, intensity, anxiety producing. But our spiritual practice isn't about making it new. Finally, it's about learning to incorporate, to embody these teachings, to become an expression of them. So yes, at the beginning we do hear something new when we're first getting into this, but sooner or later, you know, it does come around again and again and again. And what's interesting about this, I think, is that as you really begin to practice, this stops being like same old, same old. Why? Because you're really practicing with it. And you begin coming from a different place. As you hear these Four Noble Truths, you see more deeply into it. Ah, right. Oh yeah, that's what it means. You see it on deeper and deeper levels. So it actually is quite not only exciting, it's also challenging. And eventually, you know, it becomes it grips you. This is what your inner life becomes about. Not an intellectual learning of the Four Noble Truths, but how they show up in your life and how you respond to them skillfully, lovingly, mindfully. So the Four Noble Truths are, in fact, to be practiced. And I really love what Karen Armstrong says. She said, the Buddha's Dharma, or Dhamma, and that's a word for teaching, was essentially a method. It stands or falls by the extent that it works. So every single one of us who have been practicing with it know that. If it grabs you, if it makes not only logical sense, but becomes compelling, as Karen Armstrong observed, it becomes compelling because it's working in your life. That's the point. That's the point. So, I think everyone, all human beings, know the first two noble truths, that there's suffering, and the truth about craving, that it creates more suffering. Now, they're not all aware of the link between them, but everybody knows that. We who are on this spiritual path have seen even more deeply into it. We've seen, and we're working with the four of them, all four of them. Here at IMCC, I think we teachers have talked a lot about the Four Noble Truths, whether we're speaking specifically about them or we're speaking about an aspect of them. A lot of times, almost every time we've touched it one way or another. So I feel like it's time here to invite members of our community to share with you some of their own experiences. I think this can be really helpful for them. You know, it's always nice to be able to express what it really is you've been experiencing, and helpful for the rest of us to hear. So tonight I've invited 3 people who have really generously volunteered and agreed to offer their some of their experiences and insights around the first noble truth, the truth that there is suffering in life. And so, first of all, Tim Malloy. Come on up, Tim. Thanks, Tim.
Okay. Everybody hear me? All right. Thanks for having me. I think I first heard the Four Noble Truths in college, and I think the Buddha lost me on the first one. That there is suffering. I was like, you must be doing it wrong if there's suffering. And that was sort of my attitude for the next decade of my life, was to avoid suffering. And I got expertly unskillful at it. I knew when to minimize, I knew when to intellectualize, I knew when to avoid, when to escape. I had a whole repertoire of ways of avoiding suffering, or so I thought. And I thought it was working at first, I felt pretty good, was having a pretty good time, enjoying life. Unfortunately, it really wasn't working at all, and the suffering was compounding on me. It was increasing, and so I would just double down on my techniques for dealing with it, and that's all I knew how to do at this point. And I was pretty invested in it. I pretty arrogantly started this journey, and didn't want to give up on it. And so it just kept getting worse. But I wouldn't admit it to myself. I wouldn't admit it to anybody else. That would be failure, and that would be suffering. It was sort of this spiral that I couldn't get out of, this trap I'd built for myself. But finally things got bad enough that I needed to ask for help, and that was the turning point. And so for me, the first noble truth is very remedial. I needed to admit what everyone already knows, that there is suffering, and that I was suffering. And that was hard for me to even do that. But it was the beginning of an actual life and an actual opportunity, to live and to experience things. Because as all the suffering I refused to experience sort of just piled up. It doesn't move through. It just stops. You stuff it down, and it doesn't go anywhere. And it just piles up. Life got smaller, and the pile of suffering got larger. So in my sort of reaching out to myself finally, and my ridiculous ideas about suffering, someone recommended IMCC and meditation, and I was like, that sounds crazy enough that it might work, and to come here and sit in silence with my feelings that I'd been avoiding in my suffering, and sure enough, I came and I took right to it. It felt amazing to just sit here with it, and to not run, not hide, not try to outsmart it, outmaneuver it, to just experience my life, the good and the bad, it turned out, which is what I didn't know, is that there was more to it than just the suffering I was avoiding. A lot of things had gotten thrown out with that. So it's been a journey ever since, and I'm very grateful to have found this place and to have heard the Four Noble Truths a second time and, with more experienced ears and with greater humility. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks so much. Thank you, Tim. Julie Converser. Do you need to pin it on for you?
Oh, oops.
Yeah, I know.
On the scarf?
Yeah, that would be good. Maybe you got it.
Can you hear me? Am I speaking into it? Hello, my name is Julie, and I think I sort of was the opposite of Tim. When I, in college, first heard the first noble truth that life is suffering, I thought, that is absolutely correct. I really get that. And I was drawn immediately to that made complete sense to me, and that anything that started out with the first thing being that sensible was very compelling to me. Like, oh, I want to know more about that. So I'm going to tell just a story, a very specific story about a recent experience with the First Noble Truth and trying to be with it skillfully. It was an experience that involved a medical procedure, and we can typically understand, of course, in life that part of our suffering is our physical suffering. So this story is a little bit around that issue right there, which is so concrete and so real for all beings. So I was invited to have this experience with suffering, and when I talked with the surgeon beforehand, the pre-operation meeting, she informed me that the standard procedure would involve general or a spinal block for anesthesia. So it was sort of a given that, okay, we're going to numb you out, and then we'll do our work, and then we'll send you home. And I got very curious about that because of this practice. I didn't take it for absolutely granted that when she said the standard was general or spinal block, that I had to do that. I got curious. Well, I started asking her questions about the procedure, what exactly was going to be uncomfortable, what was exactly going to be painful. I got online, I did research about the procedure, and I figured that all in all, given the effects of general anesthesia or a spinal block on me personally versus what looked like it was going to be about 10 minutes tops of very intense pain, that it was kind of a wash. I could either go for numb and then sort of be sick and groggy and dull-headed for quite a while after, which is what happens to me, or I could sort of go right into the heart of pain for a very brief time and come out the other side, clear-minded. So I really checked in, decided I was willing to try to do that, and I immediately knew I would need help, because the first thing I've learned about suffering is it is definitely lessened when we have community and support. So a colleague of mine did a relaxation session with me, which we recorded, that I could listen to during the operation. Another friend agreed to come with me and to be present physically with me in any way that I needed, to attend to me before, during, and after the procedure. And I also thought of little creature comforts, how to comfort my body to ward off fear. I'm afraid of cold, so I have extra sweaters. I tend to get very cold, and operating rooms are kept extremely cold. And, of course, normally if you're out, you don't notice that. But I knew I would. So I brought a hot water bottle, and I kept on my wool hat, negotiated with the doctors and the nurses about keeping on my hat and having my hot water bottle with me. And really reached out to the doctors. The anesthesiologist came in the day of the operation and just wanted to make sure that I really didn't want any of these 10 things he had on his menu. And he reviewed every one of them again, all my options, twilight drugs and things that would just take the edge off, and et cetera, et cetera. And I knew if I took the edge off, I would take the edge off of my mindfulness. And I knew that I couldn't really do both. So I stayed with my original plan, and I asked him to encourage me throughout. So he was pretty cute. He said, "This is going to be really hard for me to see you in pain." And I said, "It's okay. We're going to be okay." So he and I came to an agreement that he would encourage me and tell me that it was going well, that I was safe, and that it was going to, sort of tell me a little bit about the process as it went. We're almost done, that kind of thing. So we went into the surgery. It went very well. During the most painful parts, I really relied on the recorded voice of this person and this human being, the anesthesiologist, who usually would just be watching monitors while his person was out, kept leaning over. He was sort of sitting up near my head, kept leaning over and saying, "You're doing great, you're safe, it's going well." And every time I heard his voice, I could just feel my entire body relax, even as this painful procedure was happening. And then when it was done, the doctor herself, who'd been quite dubious to begin, had been worried. Was worried she wasn't going to be able to do the surgery if I got, activated, which is quite reasonable. She was so pleased. She was right, of course, in the operating room. Again, I would have been out, but right there at the end of the surgery, she's like, "It went great." She came up to me and she was excited, and they rolled me out of there, and we're sort of rolling. You're lying on this thing, even though I was completely awake and fine. They make you lie down. And we're rolling through the hallways of the hospital, and there's this big sign that says recovery room, and some orderly or nurse person was starting to open the door, and the anesthesiologist was like, "Oh, she doesn't need that. Her vitals are perfect." She didn't have any anesthesia. And within an hour afterwards, I felt this great joy. I was not dopey. I was not nauseous. I was done. All these human beings had come to support me, and I understood that I could be in the heart of pain and pass through it and go home and have tea, and it was fine. So that's my story.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very beautiful. Wonderful. So, thank you to Julie. Holly, would you like to come up? Holly Robidoux. Here.
Okay, are you ready for this? I'm going to be squeaking tonight. And Susan assured me that would be just fine. And I'm not in any pain. You might be in pain or suffering listening to me. But she could sell used cars. I mean, she's really good at this. Suffering is, my understanding is the same that the other people have shared, part of life. And it's not the total part of life, but it's part of life. And I wanted to share something tonight about my own personal experience recently with regard to suffering. And the overarching idea of what I'm trying to say is that I found that the more I tried to move away from suffering, the more suffering I bring upon myself. And so I've been working at trying to stay in the here and now with suffering, which tonight I want to talk about for myself is anxiety, issues of anxiety. So to stay with it and find out that there's many benefits just to being there in the here and now with the suffering. This came to pass as a result the last couple of years I've been working on this here and in my own private practice of meditation. And recognized that when I was meditating and I would wander off, how sometimes they nudge us, perhaps you've wandered off. Treat yourself with loving kindness. Note. And then they started using this term, label. Label it. And then return to the breath and your focus and meditating. I found that very helpful. And I know that when I realize I've wandered, I'm awake and I'm back into the present and here and now. But the labeling process has been very helpful for me because I found out what I've done is that I always get lots of experiences with wandering and coming back, that when I label it, note it when I label it, I've decided that I will note and label it, and my label is, with regard to anxiety, is planning. And say I'm going to go back to my meditation and my breath, but when I'm done, not now because I want to meditate if I can, I'll come back to that and I'll look at where did I go when I wandered. And lo and behold, for the most part, I wander into planning. Planning around small things, planning around big things, planning about 10 minutes from now, planning about a day or two, planning about a year, planning about 3 years. I'm really good at that. But I realized when I was not meditating, I went back to that labeling and the planning, that it really was, as Julie mentioned as well, in a different kind of a way for me to kind of get away from the anxiety and cause me more problems because nothing's permanent and I can make all these plans and that doesn't mean any of it's going to happen. So that's been a great boon to me to make that realization about my planning as a way of avoiding suffering. And how when I'm planning, I'm not here, I'm not in the present, I'm in the future. And when I come back to my breathing, I'm again more into the now and being in the present. So that's been a great help to me. And I just want to end with a little brief, minor experience I've had with planning with Susan. About 3 weeks ago, she came up to me after the Sangha here and asked me if I would want to kind of share my own reaction and interaction with with the Four Noble Truths. And I was like a deer with the headlights, I went like, oh, and she kind of patted me on and she said, you'll be fine, and she walked away. You see what I mean by selling? And I said, okay. She was about, over the other side of the room. I said, okay, so I agreed. And then, of course, what did I do? Planning. And not only did I plan, but I planned on the Fourth Noble Truth. And so planning on the Fourth Noble Truth. And so at some point, about 5 or 6 days later, I thought, well, I better pass this by her. I went to send an email to her, and Google and Wikipedia and all those other ones were voluntarily black. So I couldn't get in there to send her an email. So on Monday morning, I checked. And it was open again. And before I could start responding, there was an email from Susan. And the email from Susan just gave us, to the three of us, were the parameters of what we were going to be doing tonight. And then right at the bottom, and it said, your assignment will be the First Noble Truth. Well, deer caught in headlights. I went, oh my God, I've been working on this, and now it's the First Noble Truth. What do I know about the First Noble Truth? And there I was suffering, right, And so I think I said, oh my God, or as my daughter will say, OMG, oh my God. And I sat there and I looked at the email and I started laughing because I realized it was exactly what I was working with. So I emailed Susan back and I explained to her that I had been working on the Fourth Noble Truth, and oh my God, now you're telling me the First Noble Truth. But I'm okay, I'm fine, I'll be there, I'll deliver, all that kind of stuff. So in a matter of a few minutes, at least from my timetable, I got a response from Susan, and she's allowed me to share it as I close. And so she got the email saying, oh, I've been working on the Fourth Noble Truth, and what am I going to do, and all this other kind of stuff. And so her response was, right there, you've got it, suffering. Working on the Fourth Noble Truth, but being asked to share on the First Noble Truth. Juicy. I'm sure you can find other examples, too. Smiley faced. Thanks for your willingness to share. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
And we hope you get well very soon.
Yeah.
Wait. Thank you, Holly. So, the First Noble Truth. The truth of suffering. And I think it's so great when you all really share. You can just see. This is all of us. This isn't just the teacher sitting up here having to say something. So I'm wondering if anybody else would like to share any idea, any experience, any insight you've had around the First Noble Truth. We're going to be talking about the second and third and the fourth later on another time. The First Noble Truth and how it has showed up in your life. Any ideas or insights around it? Linda. That was suffering. Is that, yes. Yeah. But what I hear you're saying. Right. And maybe that's what went through your mind. Is that what you're saying? That went through your mind for a moment before you actually said something. And this is suffering. For us to recognize, so it's so easy. Thank you, Linda. For us to kind of set it aside and say, that's not really suffering. That's so minor. This is minor. We sort of regard and set aside. And when we set it aside, we don't really deal with it properly. When the Buddha spoke about suffering, he didn't mean just this agonizing despair and horrible depression. He meant in all the gradations of it. And when we start opening ourselves to that and realizing that, then we realize, wow, this is really big. This is really big. From the slightest little inner twinge where there is constriction, to all the way up to despair or depression or whatever. All of it. Noticing what's happening in my life. How do I respond to it? And I'd like to point out something else that I think is so important. It becomes an insight that we eventually recognize when we work with the First Noble Truth. And that is, it's not personal. You say, what do you mean it's not personal? This is my life and it's difficult or it's really horrible or whatever. Well, this is what the Buddha said. This is what life is. There is suffering in life. So if you are experiencing suffering in any of its forms, or I'll say when you are, it's not personal. Life is being right on target. Do you see? When you can really, for yourself, have that insight, oh, this isn't all about me. It's so freeing. It's such a relief to really, really see that. This is one of the insights we can have around the First Noble Truth. Anybody else? Please. Yes, Tim.
Enduring pain for some kind of physical reward, which we could teach children to develop skills in enduring pain, enduring suffering, and gaining insight and what life experiences.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah. And what you're saying is like the precursor, the foundation for what Tim talked about a lot, and that is we've got this idea of let's avoid it. If it's physical pain, you do something medically to throw an aspirin at it or something else, but avoid pain at all costs, and we don't learn the lessons of it, and it doesn't get better. Good point. Thank you. Yeah. Anybody else? Comment. Your insights, experience. I see somebody's hand in the back. Yes, Sue. Yeah.
And having the ability to choose whether or not to be with that suffering or to let that suffering go because it's wasting time.
Thank you, Sue. Beautiful. And I hope you hear, she's not talking about trying to avoid it, trying not to look at it. I think what Sue is really talking about is what the Buddha gave the example, the story of the second arrow that we've often talked about here. There's pain in life, right? It just happens. It can't not happen in human life. But what we usually do, and that's the first arrow, but what we usually do is we add another one to it. And the other arrow is the going over and thinking about it, or planning, or adding, or avoiding it. That's where we have the decision. Wait a minute, I don't need to go there. You begin to get more sensitive. You see when your thoughts are going down a particular line, I don't need to go with this thought. You pull it back right here because it's not, you're avoiding anything. But you're just not second arrowing. You're not going over and over and over the same thing unnecessarily and building up both the emotional and the intellectual resistance and emotion about it. Thank you, Sue. Beautiful. Ginger.
I wish I had been practicing this when my mother was dying many, many years ago. I had the pleasure of having her die in my arms, and I can remember watching her, watching everything she was going through, and trying to be mindful of, I think they call it pre-agonal breathing, and what was next and what was next. But since I started practicing, I've been with 2 human beings and several animals as they have been dying. And one of the gifts I learned here is that, it's such a blessing, is that I take it, when my last dog died in my arms, I took it out and held the death process in my hand, in my arms, and I glowed, and I can remember saying, how is this feeling to me right now? Is it cold? Is it hot? What color is it? What is going on in my body as I'm watching and trying to figure out what is going on in my dog's body as she is approaching this inevitability. And even though the suffering was there, it was an amazing experience to go through dog deaths and just observe what was going on and being so grateful that I could be in that moment, really in that moment, watching that other being go through that
Yes.
doorstep, whatever. And I don't know, just as a question, I don't know if it's a worthwhile practice to try and do that. I've often tried to do it 20 years before when my mother died. I think, what was it really like? And I don't know if that's even important anymore.
To be with it, to try to really be with it?
Yeah.
How does it feel? How did it feel to you? I've heard you say amazing, and you used all kinds of wonderful. Then why doubt? Why doubt if it's worth it? That's the answer. Trust what you truly know. So it's almost 9:00. Well, let's see. We have time for one more. If there's one more person who would like to speak, have a comment. All right, then. We will see you next week. Have a beautiful week. Not too much suffering.